My mother told 11 different people at my cousin's engagement dinner that she had been cutting me out of the family inheritance. I had been standing 6 feet away the entire time. She had been holding a glass of champagne. She had been smiling in the careful way she smiled when she had been delivering bad news about me, that she had wanted to look like good news for everybody else. The dinner had been at a small private dining room in a restaurant in downtown Chicago. There had been about 40 people in the room. My mother had been working the room methodically, moving from small group to small group, delivering the same sentence with small adjustments in tone, depending on who she had been speaking to. The sentence had been, "We have finally decided. Kalantha will not be inheriting any of it. $12 million is too much to put in the hands of a daughter who has spent 15 years refusing to be part of the family business. We are leaving everything to Tobias." Tobias was my younger brother. He had been 31. He had been working at our family's company for the previous 9 years. He had been, by every reasonable measure, the son my parents had been wanting to raise. I had been 36. I had been listening. I had been smiling in the small, careful way my mother had taught me to smile. When I had been the subject of a public conversation, I was not allowed to interrupt. What my mother had not known, and what my father had not been able to tell her, was that the conversation she had been having at the engagement dinner had been a conversation about an inheritance that, by that point in the evening, had already been structurally irrelevant to my life for almost a year. I had not been the daughter she had been cutting out. I had been, in a small, careful way nobody at the dinner had been aware of, the person who had been quietly preparing to make her sentence unnecessary. I want to tell you what happened 11 months later, in a small conference room at a downtown law firm, when my mother and Tobias had been sitting across the table from my father's attorney with the original will in their hands. I want to tell you what the attorney had said when he had finished reviewing the document my mother had brought in. I want to tell you because there are people listening to this who have been told, repeatedly and publicly, that they are about to be erased by their own families, and who have been quietly figuring out, in the small daily way you figure things out alone, what to do with the information. Before I do, hit subscribe, and tell me one thing in the comments. Tell me about the moment you finally stopped trying to convince your family that you deserved to be included, and started building something that would not require their inclusion. Tell me how old you were. Tell me what you built. I read every comment. Now let me back up to the year I was 25, because the year is when the structural work started. My name is Kalantha Marshak. I am 37 years old. I am a corporate restructuring specialist at a small advisory firm in Chicago. I have spent the previous 12 years of my career helping mid-sized private companies prepare for ownership transitions, executive succession, and the small, careful financial reorganizations that companies have to do when the founding generation is preparing to hand over control to the next generation. The work has been technical. The work has been patient. The work has been, in retrospect, the exact preparation I had needed for what I had been doing inside my own family for the previous decade. My family had owned since 1962 a small manufacturing company called Marchak Industrial Components, headquartered in a small industrial park outside Chicago. The company had been founded by my paternal grandfather Stanislaw, who had emigrated from Poland in 1956, and who had built the company from a small machine shop into a regional supplier of specialized components for the automotive and aerospace industries. By the time my grandfather had died in 2009, the company had been generating roughly $40 million in annual revenue, with profit margins around 15% and a balance sheet that had included a small, careful portfolio of real estate, equipment, and goodwill that had been valued, at the time of his death, at approximately $18 million. My father, Lech, had inherited the company. My father had been the only son. My father had not been a particularly skilled businessman. He had been a steady operator, in the small way some second-generation owners are steady. He had not grown the company significantly during his 16 years of ownership. He had not shrunk it either. He had been holding it, in the way some men hold inheritances they had not built, with the assumption that he would eventually pass it to his own children. My mother, Iolanta, had been the woman behind my father. My mother had not worked at the company in any formal role. My mother had, however, been the unofficial vice president of family relations for as long as I could remember. My mother had been the one who had decided, at various points in my brother's and my upbringing, which of us was going to be groomed for the company and which of us was going to be discouraged from it. The deciding had been made early. The deciding had been made for me when I had been about 13 years old. The deciding had been the result of a small conversation between my mother and my grandfather, which I had partially overheard from the next room, in which my grandfather had said that I had the kind of analytical mind that would be useful in the business, and in which my mother had said that the business was going to be Tobias's responsibility eventually, and that I should be encouraged toward other interests. My grandfather had not pushed back. He had been close to retirement. He had been letting my parents make the calls about the next generation. He had nodded. He had let the conversation end. He had then, in the small, quiet way he sometimes did things, started spending more focused time with me in the years that followed. He had taught me, over the next 4 years until his death, the small specific details of how the company operated. He had not framed it as training. He had framed it as conversation. He had been, in retrospect, doing the same thing my mother had been telling him not to do, but in a way that had been invisible to her. He had died when I had been 17. He had not left me anything specific in his will, because he had been required, under the terms of a buy-sell agreement he had signed in the 1980s, to leave the company to my father in full. He had, however, left me his small collection of personal papers, which had included his original founding documents for the company, his small notebook of operational principles, and a brief letter he had handwritten in the last year of his life that had instructed me to be patient and to look for the right moment. I had been 17. I had not understood the letter. I had put it away. I want to tell you when I had finally taken the letter back out, because the taking out had been the start of the 11-year project that had ended at the lawyer's office. I had been 25. I had been 3 years into my first job at a small consulting firm in Chicago. I had been working on a project for a mid-sized manufacturing company that had been preparing for a generational ownership transition. The project had involved a structural mechanism I had not been previously familiar with, which had been the use of a holding company to acquire minority equity stakes in family businesses from non-active family members over time. The mechanism had been used in cases where a family had wanted to consolidate ownership in active family members without forcing inactive family members to sell at unfavorable terms. I had been studying the mechanism for the project. I had been at home one evening, looking at the small documentation I had been preparing for the client. I had been struck in a small, quiet way by the realization that the mechanism could be used in reverse. The mechanism could also be used by a family member who had been excluded from the active management of a business to gradually accumulate a structural position in the business without the active family members realizing what happened. As long as the accumulation was done through a holding company, and as long as the family members holding the equity being acquired had been willing sellers. I had thought about this for several weeks. I had then taken out my grandfather's letter. I had read it again. The letter had said, "Calantha, be patient. Look for the right moment. The company is going to be yours eventually if you are willing to do what it takes." I had understood the letter, in that moment, in a way I had not understood it at 17. I want to tell you what I did over the next 11 years, because the 11 years are the work of this story. I had spent the first year researching. I had identified, through public records and through the small, careful conversations I had been having with my grandfather's old business associates who had still been around, that the company had 3 categories of equity holders. The first category had been my father, who had owned approximately 70% of the equity through a direct ownership stake. The second category had been a small group of non-active family members and old business associates of my grandfather, who collectively had owned about 20% through small minority stakes from the original founding period. The third category had been a small employee stock ownership pool that had been established in the 1980s for a few senior employees, which had accounted for the remaining 10%. I had been most interested in the second category. The non-active family members and old business associates had been, by the time I had been 25, in their 70s and 80s. They had been holding small minority stakes that had been generating modest dividend income, but that had been illiquid and difficult to sell. Several of them had been quietly looking for buyers for their stakes for years. None of them had been finding buyers, because the stakes had not been publicly tradable, and because most outside buyers had not been interested in minority positions in a family business. I had set up a small holding company. I had called it Halcyon Industrial Partners. The name had been chosen because it had been generic enough to not raise any flags within my family, and because the word Halcyon had been a word my grandfather had occasionally used in his small operational notes to describe the company's best operating periods. I had retained a small, careful attorney named Mr. Sebastian Janowski, who had specialized in private company equity transactions and who had agreed to manage the small acquisitions on my behalf. I had explained the structure to him. He had told me the structure was legal, that the structure had been used many times before in similar contexts, and that the structure would work as long as I was patient and as long as I had been willing to accumulate the stakes slowly. I had then, over the next 11 years, slowly acquired equity in the company from the non-active family members and the old business associates of my grandfather. I had bought stakes from 7 different holders. I had paid above market prices in every case, because I had wanted the sellers to be pleased with the transactions, and because I had been buying with money I had been earning at my consulting job, supplemented by a small inheritance I had received from my grandmother on my mother's side when I had been 28, which had been $190,000. The purchases had been small enough, individually, that they had not triggered any review or notification requirements within the company. The minority shareholders had been required, under the company's bylaws, to notify the company of any transfers of their stakes, which they had done. The notifications had been received by the company's corporate secretary, a long-tenured woman named Mrs. Henrietta Volkov, who had been with the company since 1979 and who had been my grandfather's personal hire. Mrs. Volkov had processed the notifications. Mrs. Volkov had not flagged them to anybody in the family. I want to tell you about Mrs. Volkov, because Mrs. Volkov had been a quiet ally without ever explicitly being one. Mrs. Volkov had been the corporate secretary. Mrs. Volkov had also been, by virtue of her 36 years of tenure with the company, one of the few people who had been close enough to my grandfather to remember his preferences. Mrs. Volkov had known, from a small conversation she had had with my grandfather in 2008, that he had been hoping I would eventually find a way into the business. Mrs. Volkov had been 71 when I had started buying stakes. Mrs. Volkov had received the first notification with a small recognition of what had been happening. Mrs. Volkov had not done anything about it. Mrs. Volkov had simply, in the careful professional way she did her job, processed the notifications and filed them. She had never spoken to me directly about it during the 11 years. We had never had a conversation. We had been, in the small parallel way colleagues can be allied without ever speaking, working toward the same outcome without coordinating. By the time I had been 35, I had accumulated approximately 18% of the company's equity through Halcyon Industrial Partners. The 18% had been useful, but had not been controlling. The controlling block had been my father's 70%. The remaining 12% had been held by the original employee stock pool and by 2 of the original minority holders who had not been willing to sell. What had changed the situation had been my father's diagnosis. My father had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in the spring of the year I had been 36. He had been 68 at the time. The diagnosis had been serious. The prognosis had been, by the doctor's estimate, 12 to 18 months. My father had not told me about the diagnosis directly. I had found out about it through my uncle Dvorin, my father's younger brother, who had been one of the original minority holders and who I had bought a stake from in 2018. My uncle had called me on a Tuesday evening. He had told me that my father had been ill. He had told me that the family had been keeping it quiet. He had told me that he had been worried about what would happen to the company after my father was gone, and that he had been hoping I would consider, despite the family situation, getting involved in the transition. I had told my uncle I would think about it. I had thanked him for the call. I had thought about it for 3 days. I had then, on the Friday after the call, asked Mr. Janowski to set up a meeting with my father. The meeting had been a business meeting. I had been representing Halcyon Industrial Partners. My father had been representing the company. My father had been confused when he had received the meeting request. He had not known what Halcyon Industrial Partners had been. He had asked his own attorney, an older man named Mr. Donatian Lindqvist, to look into it. Mr. Lindqvist had reviewed the company filings. Mr. Lindqvist had then, in the small, careful way attorneys handle situations like this, called Mr. Janowski to discuss the meeting. The 2 attorneys had agreed on the agenda. My father had been informed before the meeting that Halcyon Industrial Partners had been the holder of an 18% equity position in Marchak Industrial Components, that the position had been built up over the previous 11 years through a series of legal acquisitions, and that the principal of Halcyon Industrial Partners had been requesting a confidential meeting to discuss the future of the company. My father had not been told before the meeting that I was the principal of Halcyon Industrial Partners. I had been 36. I had walked into the small conference room at Mr. Lindqvist's office on a Friday afternoon in May. My father had been sitting at the small conference table with Mr. Lindqvist. My father had been wearing a small navy suit. He had been thin. He had been the kind of thin that had been new to him in the previous several months. He had not been expecting me. He had looked up. He had been quiet for a long moment. He had then said, in a voice I had not heard him use in many years, "Calantha, are you Halcyon Industrial Partners?" I had told him yes. He had been quiet for another long moment. He had then started crying. I had not seen my father cry since my grandfather's funeral, when I had been 17. I had not been prepared for him to cry. I had stood by the door of the conference room without knowing what to do. Mr. Lindqvist had given my father a small handkerchief. Mr. Janowski had been waiting in the hallway outside. The four of us had sat in the small conference room for a long, quiet moment. My father had finally said, "Your grandfather told me, before he died, that you would find a way back to the company eventually." He had said it in the small, careful way he sometimes said important things. I had not understood what he had meant. I had thought he had been talking about you eventually asking for a job. I had been telling your mother, for years, that you were not going to ask for a job, and that she had been right about you. I had been wrong. He had been right. He had been waiting for this. I have been waiting for this. I just have not known I had been waiting. I want to tell you what we had discussed in that meeting, because the discussion had been the foundation of everything that followed. I had told my father that I had not been interested in taking over the operational management of the company. I had told him that I had built Halcyon Industrial Partners specifically because the operational management had not been my interest. I had told him that I had been, instead, interested in being the structural owner of the company, with operational management handled by professional executives who would be hired through a small, careful search process. I had told him that Mrs. Volkov, who had been with the company for 36 years, could be brought into the planning. I had told him that Tobias, my brother, could continue in his current operational role, with appropriate compensation and an oversight, but that Tobias would not be in the chain of structural ownership. My father had asked me what I had been proposing. I had told him I had been proposing to acquire his 70% equity position over the 11 months following the meeting, through a structured purchase that would convert his ownership into a long-term annuity, payable to him during his remaining life and then to my mother during her remaining life. The annuity would be generous. The annuity would not be contingent on either of them being involved in the company. The annuity would be funded by the company's ongoing operating cash flow, with Halcyon Industrial Partners as the new majority owner. My father had been quiet for a long time. He had then asked me whether I had thought through the implications for the family. He had asked me whether my mother had known about any of this. He had asked me whether Tobias had known. I had told him that nobody in the family had known. I had told him that I had been planning to keep it that way until the structural transition had been completed. I had told him that I had been intending, at the appropriate moment, to inform my mother and Tobias about the new ownership structure of the company, in a manner that would be respectful but firm. My father had been quiet again. He had then said, in a voice that had been even smaller than the voice he had been using earlier, "Calantha, I have been a coward with your mother for 37 years. I have let her decide which of our children would be the one your grandfather had been hoping I would protect. She had decided your brother. I had not pushed back. I had known, somewhere inside me, that she had been wrong. I had been afraid to say so. I am tired of being afraid. I want you to take the company. I want you to take it on the terms you have proposed. I want you to handle your mother however you decide to handle her. I am going to be with you in the transition. I am going to be on your side. I am sorry I have not been on your side until now. I had not been able to respond immediately. I had cried quietly. My father had crossed the room and had hugged me. In the small, awkward way fathers who have not hugged their daughters in decades hug them when they are finally allowed to. We had spent the next 11 months executing the structural transition. The transition had involved a series of small, careful steps. Mr. Janowski and Mr. Lindqvist had coordinated the legal documentation. Mrs. Volkov had been brought into the planning. A small executive search firm had been retained to identify a professional chief executive officer to take over operational management once the transition had been completed. The new CEO, a man named Mr. Reinhard Anderson, had been hired in the 8th month. Mr. Anderson had been a 54-year-old executive with 30 years of industrial manufacturing experience. He had been excited about the role. He had not known the family backstory. He had been told he would report to the principal of Halcyon Industrial Partners, who would be the new majority owner once the transition had been completed. My father had been involved in the planning throughout. My father had been the one who had told me, in a quiet conversation about 6 months in, that the planning had been the most engaged he had felt with the company since my grandfather had died. My father had been the one who had introduced me to several of the long-tenured employees who would be staying through the transition. My father had been the one who had walked me through the small details of the company's history that had not been written down anywhere. My mother had not known any of this during the 11 months. My father had not told her. My father had been firm, in his small, careful way, that the transition needed to be completed before my mother was brought in, because my mother would have tried to disrupt the transition if she had known about it in advance. My brother Tobias had been told in the 9th month. My father had been the one who had told him. Tobias had been initially angry. Tobias had calmed down within about 2 weeks after he had been walked through the structure by my father and by Mr. Lindqvist, and after he had understood that his operational role at the company would not be disrupted. Tobias had also been told, in a small private conversation with my father, that he had been being prepared for ownership of a company he had not been suited to own, that my father had been wrong to let my mother make that decision for both of his children, and that my father had been hoping Tobias could eventually understand and accept what had been happening. Tobias had eventually understood. Tobias had not been my favorite person growing up. Tobias had, however, become a different person in the months following the conversation with my father. He had reached out to me directly in the 10th month. We had had dinner together. We had talked for several hours. He had told me in his small, careful way that he had not realized until our father had explained it to him the extent to which he had been a beneficiary of our mother's pattern. He had told me he had been sorry. He had told me he had been hoping we could be a different kind of siblings going forward. I had been cautious. I had also been willing. The transition had been completed in the 11th month, 3 weeks before my father had been admitted to the hospital for the final time. I want to tell you what happened in the lawyer's office 2 weeks after my father had died, because the lawyer's office moment had been the moment my mother had finally been told. My father had requested in his final weeks that the family meeting about the will be held at Mr. Lindqvist's office on a specific date. The date had been 13 days after his projected passing, which my father had calculated with the small, careful accuracy of a man who had been told by his doctors how much time he had left. The date had been honored. My father had passed 3 days earlier than the doctors had projected. The meeting had been held on the original date anyway. My mother had arrived at the meeting wearing a small black dress. Tobias had been with her. My mother had been holding a small folder. The folder had contained a copy of the original will, which my father had executed in 2018 and which my mother had been familiar with, in which my father had left the company and the bulk of his estate to Tobias, with smaller bequests to my mother, with a small token bequest to me of $40,000, and with various other small bequests to family members and charitable organizations. My mother had been carrying the folder into the meeting as if it had been a trophy. My mother had been smiling in the small, careful way she smiled when she had been about to receive recognition for something she had been planning for years. I had been in the meeting room when she had arrived. I had been sitting at the small conference table with Mr. Lindqvist. Mr. Janowski had been sitting next to me. Mr. Anderson, the new CEO of the company, had been on a small speakerphone in the middle of the table because he had been at a customer meeting in Detroit and had not been able to attend in person. My mother had been surprised to see me. She asked Mr. Lindqvist why I had been at the meeting. Mr. Lindqvist had told her, in the small, careful voice he used for difficult moments, that I had been at the meeting because the meeting was about the future of the company, and because I had been the principal of the entity that owned the company. He had then told her that the will she had been holding had been the original will, executed in 2018, and that the will had been substantially superseded by a series of structural transactions that had been executed over the previous 12 months, with my father's full participation and consent. My mother had stared at him. She had been quiet for a long moment. She had then said, in the small voice she sometimes used when she had not been certain what was happening, but had been certain she had not been going to like it, Donatian. What are you talking about? Mr. Lindqvist had said, in the small, clear voice he had been preparing for this moment, Iolanta, that will is now worthless. The company is no longer your husband's to bequeath. The company has been owned, as of 3 weeks before your husband's death, by Halcyon Industrial Partners. The principal of Halcyon Industrial Partners is your daughter Calantha. The company has been operating under a new CEO since your husband's death. Your husband's estate consists of the proceeds of the structured sale, which he had arranged to be paid out as a generous lifetime annuity to you. You will be receiving the annuity for the remainder of your life. The annuity is approximately $150,000 per year, indexed to inflation. The annuity is in addition to a small lump sum of $200,000 that your husband had set aside for you. The combined arrangement provides for your full financial security for the remainder of your life. You will not, however, be inheriting the company. Tobias will also not be inheriting the company. Tobias has been informed of all of this and has accepted the arrangement. Calantha is the majority owner of the company. The transition is complete. There is nothing in the will you are holding that changes any of this. My mother had not been able to speak for almost a minute. She had been holding the folder with both hands. The folder had been the only thing she had brought to the meeting. The folder had become, in the small clarifying way physical objects become, the symbol of a decision she had been making about her own family for 36 years that had been quietly undone over the previous 11 months. She had finally said, let you do this. I had said yes, she had said without telling me. I had said yes. She had said, why? I had told her that my father had been doing it because he had been finally tired of being afraid of her. I had told her that he had been telling me, in our final conversations, that he had been wishing he had been a different kind of husband for 36 years. I had told her that he had been hoping she would be able to use the years of her remaining life to understand what he had been doing and why. I had told her that the annuity was generous enough that she would never have to worry about money. I had told her that I was not interested in any further conversation about the situation today, but that I would be available, eventually, for conversations about how we would relate to each other going forward. I had stood up. I had walked out of the conference room. I had taken the elevator down to the lobby. I had walked out of the building. I had driven home. I want to tell you what has happened in the 18 months since. The company has been operating well under Mr. Anderson's leadership. Revenue is up about 8% in the 18 months. We have hired 12 new employees. We have expanded into a small new product line that we had been considering for years but had not been pursuing under my father's management. The company has been, in the small, careful way some companies improve under new ownership, becoming a healthier version of itself. My brother Tobias has been continuing in his operational role. He has been promoted, on Mr. Anderson's recommendation, to Vice President of Operations. Tobias and I have been having dinner about once a month. The dinners have been pleasant. We are figuring out, slowly, what kind of siblings we are going to be on the other side of the family pattern we had grown up inside. My mother has been receiving her annuity. She has been living comfortably. She has been, by all accounts I have received from Tobias and from my uncle Devorin, struggling with the reality of what had happened. She has been trying to understand it. She has been failing to fully understand it. She has been calling me about once every 6 weeks. The calls have been short. The calls have been not warm. I have been polite. We are not close. We may never be close. I have accepted this. I have not been planning to push for closeness. The closeness, if it ever arrives, will arrive on her side. I will be ready to receive it if it does. I am not waiting. Mrs. Volkov retired 6 months after the transition was completed. She is 83. She had stayed long enough to ensure the transition had been smooth. She had then taken her retirement with the small, careful dignity she had brought to everything she had done at the company. I had bought her a small farewell gift. The gift had been a framed copy of one of my grandfather's old operational principles, which he had written on a small index card in 1971, that Mrs. Volkov had been keeping in her desk drawer for the previous 42 years. The principle had read, in my grandfather's small, careful handwriting, "The right person is sometimes the person nobody is looking at." Mrs. Volkov had cried when I had given it to her. I had cried too. I want to tell you what I have learned. The learning has been the foundation of everything I have been thinking about for the past 2 years. The first thing I have learned is that the people in your family who are publicly bragging about cutting you out of an inheritance are not always people you need to confront, persuade, or correct. They are sometimes people whose loudness has been giving you cover for the quieter work you have been doing. My mother had been telling 40 people at a dinner that she had been cutting me out of the family inheritance. The telling had been her way of consolidating her own position. The telling had also been, in a way she had not understood, a small public commitment by her to a story that had already been structurally outdated. She had been performing certainty about a future that I had been quietly making different. The performing had not been my problem to address. The performing had been her problem, eventually, to live with. If somebody in your family is publicly performing certainty about your future in a way that excludes you, please consider that the performing is not always a thing you need to interrupt. The performing is sometimes the loudest noise in the room, and the loudest noise can give you cover to do quieter things that will eventually make the performing irrelevant. The making irrelevant is the work. The work does not require an audience. The work is sometimes the work of decades. The performing, if it has been going on for years, has been giving you cover the whole time. The cover is real. Use it. The second thing I have learned is that the family member who has been quietly on your side, but who has been afraid to say so, can sometimes be activated by the right structural moment in their own life. My father had been on my side secretly for 36 years. He had not been able to say so. He had been afraid of my mother. He had been afraid in the small, specific way some husbands are afraid of their wives, which is the kind of fear that is invisible to outsiders, and that the husband himself has rarely been able to name. My father had been activated by his cancer diagnosis. The diagnosis had given him a deadline. The deadline had clarified, for him, what he had been wanting to do with his remaining time. The clarifying had broken something in him that needed to be broken. The breaking had been the precondition for the 11 months of work we had done together. If you have a family member who you believe is secretly on your side but who has not been able to act on it, please consider that the activation may not come from anything you do. The activation may come from something that happens to them. The something might be illness. The something might be a personal loss. The something might be the small clarifying recognition that they are running out of time to be the person they had been wanting to be. The activation cannot be forced. The activation can, however, be received when it arrives. If you are prepared structurally for what you would do with the activation if it came, you will be able to receive it. If you are not prepared, the activation will arrive and you will not have what you need to use it. The preparing is the work. The preparing happens during the years when the family member is not yet activated. The preparing is the long, quiet investment in your own readiness. Be ready. The activation may come. The activation may not come. Either way, the preparing has built something in you that the family member would not have been able to give you, even if they had been able to act on their feelings the whole time. The something is the foundation of who you will be, regardless of how anybody in your family eventually behaves toward you. The third thing I have learned, and the last one I want to give to you, is that the kind of person who builds quietly for years is sometimes not the kind of person who is recognized in the moment when the building becomes visible. My mother, at the lawyer's office, had not congratulated me. My mother had not acknowledged what I had done. My mother had not said anything that would have indicated that she had finally understood who I had been all along. My mother had only said the word why, and had then sat with the folder in her lap, and had not been able to speak. The lack of recognition had not been a failure of the moment. The lack of recognition had been a feature of who my mother was. My mother had not been the kind of person who could recognize, in real time, what had happened in front of her. My mother had not been the kind of person who could acknowledge having been wrong. My mother was going to spend the rest of her life slowly catching up, in her own small private way, with what had happened. The catching up was hers to do. The recognition was hers to find if she could find it. The witnessing of my work by my mother was never going to happen. The witnessing had to be done by other people. The other people had been my grandfather, who had seen what I had been capable of when I had been 13, and had spent the next 4 years preparing me. The other people had been Mrs. Volkov, who had been quietly receiving my acquisition notifications for 11 years, and had been quietly knowing what had been happening. The other people had been Mr. Janowski, who had been my attorney for the entire build. The other people had been my uncle Davorin, who had been calling me about my father's illness. The other people had been my brother Tobias, eventually, who had come around. The other people had been my father, in the last 11 months. The other people had been the people who had been able to witness what I had been doing. The other people had been enough. The other people had been the audience the work had actually needed. The audience my mother had refused to be was not the audience that had been worth performing for. The audience that had recognized me was the audience that had mattered. If you are building quietly, please consider that the audience for your building is not always the audience you had been imagining. The audience you had been imagining is sometimes the audience that cannot or will not see what you have been doing. The audience that can see is sometimes a different audience entirely, made up of people you had not been counting on, who arrive in your life at small, specific moments, and who provide the recognition that the original audience cannot. Find that audience. Build for them. The original audience will or will not eventually catch up. The catching up is not your work. Your work is the building. The building is for the people who can see it. The seeing is what matters. The seeing is enough. I want to ask you something before you go. Tell me, in the comments, about the moment you realized that the audience you had been performing for, in your family, was not the audience that was ever going to see you. Tell me when you figured it out. Tell me who the new audience turned out to be. Tell me whether you have built, for the new audience, the kind of life you had been hoping the old audience would eventually witness. There are more of us than the families who refuse to see us would ever guess. We have been building for years for audiences they will never recognize, and the audiences have been finding us, slowly in small, specific moments. Tell me yours. I will be reading every single comment. I will see you in the next one.